The most exciting thing in NASCAR may well become the most exciting thing about the 104th running of the Indianapolis 500, at least in the lead up to the greatest spectacle in racing. Indeed, we got new information this weekend about the possibility of Kyle Busch running the Indianapolis 500, and you might be surprised about which engine would be in the back of his potential Indy 500 entry. Now, what we're going to talk about in this video, we're going to first break down what has broken over the weekend and some of the new details. We're also going to talk about some of the things that are going to be standing in Kyle Busch's way of getting on the Indy 500 entry list. Many of these things have been talked about ad nauseum, but I want to break them down as simply as possible and try to update many people who maybe have some outdated information on some of the things that are constantly brought up whenever you talk about a NASCAR driver potentially doing an Indy 500 run. But first, let's get to the tweet itself, because it really is something that's going to set a lot of things in motion, and it's also going to narrow down what teams Kyle Busch could potentially run the Indianapolis 500 for. So the tweet in question comes from Jenna of the Associated Press. Go follow her because she's been a great follow at the Roar before the 24 at Daytona, because she's been giving us some information like this. She was responding to Bob Pockrass talking about the potential of Kyle Busch running the Indy 500 in 2017, which didn't come to pass. Make a note of that because we'll be talking about that later. She says, Kyle has approval to run Indy with a Chevy engine. He does not have a deal or anything, but he can do it if something were to be put together. So obviously this is major news for several reasons, because one of the major stepping stones, one of the major things that the hurdles, if you will, that Kyle Busch had to get over if he was going to run the Indy 500 would be to get Toyota's approval to run in the Indy 500. Now, many people, myself included, and in fact, I think I've talked about this in a video just a couple of months ago when we were talking about the Busch brothers potentially doing the Indy 500, was that Kyle is essentially the face of Toyota Motorsports in the United States. It's part of the reason why he's in a Lexus GTD car at the Rolex 24. Of course, Lexus is owned by Toyota, so there's an obvious crossover marketing appeal there. The question that I had, and many other people had, was, would Toyota be open to the possibility of him jumping in, say, a Honda-powered car or a Chevy-powered car? Obviously, I probably don't need to explain too much about the Honda-Toyota rivalry, but if you don't understand it, just think Ford versus Chevy, but Japanese style. The question of Chevy was more of a, would Toyota really want their NASCAR driver, who races a Toyota against Chevys in NASCAR, jumping over to the Indy 500 and running with a Chevy? We now have the answer to that, and apparently Toyota is A-OK with Kyle Busch running a Chevy-powered car. Now, some people may be scratching their heads a little bit because, again, like I just said, the possibility of their top driver in NASCAR driving for the opposing brand in NASCAR is a bit strange, but let me offer you this. And it's a little bit of an insight as well into why there's rumors of Fernando Alonso doing the Indy 500 next year in a Honda. The reason potentially that Alonso was driving a Chevy last year was not because of GP2 engine or that meme, but because of the fact that he was a Toyota associated or affiliated driver at the time, of course, racing in their World Endurance Championship program. And the fact that he got a Honda test at all, or a test with a Honda car at Barber Motorsports Park on the road course with Andretti Autosport, was made so because of the fact that there were no Honda logos anywhere on the car. That was a big controversy at that time. So it definitely seems to me like the sticking point with Toyota is much less about bad-mouthing, and certainly Kyle Busch has not bad-mouthed Toyota at all, to my knowledge. So he's definitely in their good graces. And Fernando Alonso certainly did some bad-mouthing of Honda, but that doesn't seem to be really the sticking point. It seems to be more that a Toyota driver will not drive for Honda when they are contracted to Toyota. So from that perspective, Kyle Busch in a Chevy, that works. That starts to open up a whole lot of possibilities that I'll talk about just a little bit later. But I do want to touch on a couple other things, a couple other hurdles that I think a lot of people have when talking about Kyle Busch and doing the Indy 500. Number one is Samantha Busch. Of course, that's his wife. They have a child together, Brexton, and from what their social media seems to give off, they have a pretty close relationship, and they seem to be very happy together. And obviously, that's a good thing. But many people have kind of looked at that relationship and said, oh, that could be a stumbling block, because in the past there have been other NASCAR drivers. Jimmy Johnson is probably the best example of this, where there was a driver with desire to do the Indy 500, but the wife said, look, Jimmy, I love you, you can't do it. And here's the deal. I could have sworn Samantha had commented on this before, but I could not find a quote, so I'm not going to claim that she's 100% on board with it. But I will say this. When Kyle Busch wants to shut something down, when he doesn't want to talk about it, or when I would imagine something upsets his wife for him to talk about, he probably isn't going to talk about it. I mean, look at the Marshawn Lynch impression that he did, or some of the times where he said, I'm just not going to comment on the package because I know it's going to get me in trouble. If commenting on the Indy 500 and stating over and over and over again that he wants to do the Indy 500 was going to get him in trouble with his wife, I'm guessing Kyle Busch would not do it. Instead, you've got Kyle Busch pretty much at every opportunity he's asked saying, yes, I want to do it, and clearly telling Jenna Fryer here, hey, I can do it if I have a Chevy team. Clearly he had a deal put together in 2017, and that fell through. So again, I don't think the wife is the problem. The problem, at least in 2017, was Joe Gibbs. And here's where we get into the weeds, a little bit anyway. So this was all this information that we're talking about with Joe Gibbs specifically has been reported by Bob Pockrass of Fox Sports. And Pockrass said specifically that Kyle Busch had a deal to race in the Indy 500 in 2017. Now, I think Kyle himself has actually mentioned it was with Penske, so take that with what you will. But it was fully funded, he was ready to go, and Joe Gibbs stepped in and said, you're not doing it. That apparently has changed. As reported by Bob Pockrass, again, in early 2019, when Kyle Busch signed a new contract with Joe Gibbs Racing right before the Vegas round, it was reported specifically by Pockrass that there was a clause in the contract that Busch could do the Indy 500 under certain circumstances. Now, those circumstances have not been specified, but you would probably imagine that it has something to do with winning a cup championship, another cup championship, before running the Indy 500, which he has now accomplished. Outside of that, I would guess that there may be another one that has to do with something like you have to win before May, because otherwise you're not going to be in the playoffs, and then that's going to be in trouble. Joe Gibbs obviously has had a bit of a bias towards drivers doing the Indy 500 Coke 600 double, because he had a driver that did it in the past, Tony Stewart, and I can't remember any specific quotes from Joe Gibbs himself, but I remember Greg Zipadelli, I think at one point, or Greg Zipadelli, sorry, I kind of mispronounced that, at one point commented how he saw how Tony Stewart was affected by it and didn't necessarily agree with the process of doing the double. Now, here is the thing, that NASCAR in the 90s or the early 2000s is a lot different than it is now. Like I said, you can get a win and you're in championship contention. Tony Stewart going and doing that in 99 and 2001, it was a little bit different times then. There was a potential that he could take a hit in the points with having a bad race at the Coke 600, and then that could affect his championship at the end of the season because it was a points-based championship. Now it's a win-based championship, and obviously Kyle Busch does a lot of that these days. So from that perspective, it seems like many of the hurdles are out of the way. So let's talk about, kind of pie in the sky here, what teams are available to Kyle Busch and which ones are the most likely that he could land. Okay, so we know that the Indy 500 attempt with Kyle Busch, if it does happen, has to happen with a Chevy engine in the back of the car. Now, last year, going by last year anyway, for the Indy 500, there were 18 Chevrolet-powered entries. Now, it's worth noting that there were only 15 that started the race, as all 3 of the cars that were bumped from the field were powered by Chevy motors. That being said, each team that represented Chevy got at least one car into the field. You might be able to make an exception for the McLaren team, which was affiliated with Carlin. So if you want to count that as a separate team, you could say McLaren was the only team that ended up with a car being sent home. But regardless, you've got those possibilities going forward. So essentially, he's got 18 shots, even though obviously that's not totally true because there's the full-time entries, which of course Chevy has significantly less than Honda. Generally speaking, there are more Indy 500 only entries coming out of the Chevy stable because they have less full-time rides. And so it seems like, it's funny, I talked about this literally in a video 2 days ago about the Indy 500 entry list. I said at the time it seemed like maybe the Indy 500 entry list is going to be down a little bit from the 36 last year, but now kind of thinking about it, Honda gave Jenna a quote that said, hey, we're preparing for 18 cars, or to supply 18 cars, and if Honda supplies 18 cars, and what I'm looking at here with Chevy, if they supply the same amount of engines they did last year, which is 18, that gets you to 36 once again. So which of the 36 entries are most likely for Kyle Busch to end up in? I'll kind of go from the ones that are least likely to the most likely. I'll kind of run through some of these pretty quick. So Dragon Speed, I don't see that. That's a one-car team, partial season effort, and they prefer to have sports car aces in that seat. It's either going to be Ben Hanley or there's a possibility it could be Colin Braun as well. Both of those drivers race for them in sports cars, so I don't see any possibilities there. AJ Foyt Racing. Quite frankly, that team's not very competitive. I don't think that would be a place that Kyle Busch would want to make his first Indy 500 start, even if the seat was available to him. And it seems like they have several funded drivers that are waiting in the wings there. Carlin Racing, kind of the same deal. The other problem, of course, is that they struggled to qualify last year. They only got one car in the field with Charlie Kimball, and it seems like there's going to be a lot of rookies on that team anyway this year, so I would suspect that Carlin's off the table. Juncos Racing. There's a real possibility that this team may not even have an entry in the Indy 500 next year. They had to put their IMSA DPI program on a hiatus, and I haven't seen any public comments from them regarding an IndyCar program for this year. So I would say that entry is up in the air, period. Regardless, I don't think it's a place that Kyle Busch could go. Clausen Marshall Racing, which was associated with AJ Foyt Racing last year. Pippa Mann was the driver. I'm guessing that's not an available seat for Kyle Busch, even though I think there is some sponsor crossover between that team and Kyle Busch with NOS Energy. So maybe there's a possibility there. Who knows? Brian Reinbold Racing, another Indy 500 only team, and they have their two drivers, Sage Karam and J.R. Hildebrand. I'm guessing they're okay with them, but again, you kind of think if there was a good enough offer, I'm sure they would consider one from Kyle Busch. But this is kind of where we get into the meat and potatoes, are the teams that really probably have the best opportunity to field Kyle Busch. You start thinking about Ed Carpenter Racing. Now, the problem with them is that they're traditionally a three-car operation, and they've already got their three cars confirmed, which are Connor Daly, Rinus VeeKay, and, of course, Ed Carpenter. So the possibility of them adding a fourth car, I would say, is pretty unlikely, despite the fact that they were willing to accommodate Danica Patrick when she wanted to do the Indy 500 with sponsorship, obviously, from GoDaddy. But again, there isn't a seat available. It would be a fourth-string car there. It's hard to see that being a possibility. Then you get to McLaren. So McLaren is an interesting thing because, yes, they have two full-time rookies, Pato O'Ward and Oliver Askew. I've heard some rumors that possibly Sebastian Bourdais would be in a third car for them for the Indy 500. We, of course, know Fernando Alonso is now off the table. Would there be a possibility that Kyle Busch could be a third or fourth entry at that team? Maybe. If there's one thing we do know about McLaren is they love publicity, whether it's good or bad, they'll take it. Just look at the paint controversy from last year. So I could see, there's a world where I could see Kyle Busch driving for McLaren. Do I think it's going to happen this year? I would say that's pretty unlikely at this point, but stranger things have happened. Speaking of strange, remember when Roger Penske bought the Indy 500, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and that whole enchilada that included the IndyCar series at the end of 2019? Well, at the time I'm making this video, January 5th, tomorrow will be the first day that Roger Penske officially owns the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And you don't think that he wants to make a splash for his first Indy 500? I'm pretty sure a splash and a lot of free promotion would be coming his way if he somehow managed to wrangle both Fernando Alonso and Kyle Busch onto the entry list for that race. And certainly when you're talking about the United States, Kyle Busch would make a huge impact. Not saying, I'm just saying, especially considering that Kyle Busch has made public comments in the past that he was looking at Penske to drive for in 2017. Why not? Why not have a fifth Team Penske car for Kyle Busch at the Indy 500? He would, of course, be paired with Helio Castroneves, Simon Pagenaud, Will Power, and Joseph Newgarden. 3 of those 4 drivers have won the Indy 500, and the one who hasn't has won 2 series championships in the last 3 years. So that's a very stout team. That would be a great place for him to go, get some great experience, get some great feedback, be in a car that absolutely can win the race right off the bat. It's essentially the Fernando Alonso situation from 2017. And again, not trying to spend other people's money here, but I'll just say this. If Roger's looking for a huge amount of promotion, at a cost that obviously, running an Indy 500 program, a top-of-the-line Indy 500 program, does cost a lot of money. I'm guessing they could get some sponsors, especially if they said, hey, Kyle Busch has a chance to win the Indy 500. Let's slap an M&M's logo on the side of our DW12 and go racing. The free promotional aspect or the amount of press that would be generated for Kyle Busch going to the Indy or running the Indy 500, attempting to qualify for the Indy 500, ticket sales, all those things. When you think that, hey, maybe it's $1 million investment, would you rather invest that into Facebook ads or TV commercials, or do you get an entry for a star driver and then you let the press do the rest with the promotion, just constantly dogging Kyle Busch throughout the month of May? And kind of following his wacky adventures as he runs the double. I don't know. I think if it happens, hot take. Let's get the swoosh going, or it might be a complete airball. Who knows? If it happens, it'll be with Roger Penske's team, and it'll be a house car essentially. It'll be one that they write off their taxes as a marketing expense and go racing, so to speak. Anyway, I would never accuse them of doing that, but yeah, I think if it happens, it'll be with Roger Penske's team. But who knows? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section below. I would be very excited to hear your thoughts on the possibilities contained with the potential of Kyle Busch running the Indianapolis 500 this year, next year, or several years in the future. I'm excited to hear it. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube, and I will see you in the next video.